Thank you all for joining us. We'll be beginning in a minute. Each of the speakers are coming in from our green room practice, making sure that we were well set up. So we're just going to wait a minute for people to come. You can see the panel is being coming on one by one, and here we are together. So let me open by saying thank you so much for joining us and continuing to be on the Clinical Trial Diversity Summit. This is an incredibly exciting two-day conference for us. My name is Barbara Beerer. I am the professor of medicine and pediatrics at Harvard Medical School and the faculty director of the Multi-Regional Clinical Trials Center of Harvard and the Brigham and Women's Hospital. It gives me great pleasure to moderate this panel, partly because I don't have to do the work other than managing everyone on the panel. I think this is a really transformative time in our country and the globe. Unfortunate for the reasons that we all know in terms of the pandemic, unfortunate in terms of the social justice reckoning that we needed to have, but I think we needed to have it as a country. And I think that we're really doubling down and taking this effort to increase diverse inclusion in clinical research seriously, with commitment, with sort of an intentionality that I've never seen before. And it's high time. One of the things that is really impressive is the amount of work that each of us will need to do in our organizations and ourselves to bring this to reality. And that's really what we're going to focus on today with this panel. So I'm going to introduce the panelists and stop talking, but maybe I'll introduce you all first and then ask you each to give comments on sort of how your organization is approaching this issue, what metrics you're using, and sort of how you've thought about addressing this very large question and issue in our society and in our work. And I just said that so that you could have a few minutes to think about how you're going to answer while I do the introductions. So first, it gives me great pleasure to introduce, I have to get my cheat sheet, Asha Collins, who is the U.S. Clinical Operations Head at Genentech, cancer biologist by training, and is accountable for late-stage clinical trials conducted in the United States across the entire portfolio, and is also the global lead of Roche's Investigator Technology Platforms Group. I'll next introduce Daryl Streep, who is the Chief Medical Officer and Senior Vice President of Global Medical at Amgen. Previously, he was at Takeda, Abbott, and a number of other places. As you'll hear from him, he graduated from Wits in South Africa and is a urologist by background. I'll next introduce Lisa Dunkel, who is the VP of Clinical Development, a global medical lead for COVID-19 vaccine at Novavax, and came out of retirement actually to join that effort in the fight against COVID-19. Thank you for that effort. Previously, she was the Chief Medical Officer at Protein Sciences, a Sanofi company, and prior to that, in a number of other companies prior to her departure from academia. Melanie Iverson is the Chief Development Officer at Moderna and heads the Clinical Development Operations Department. Previously, she was the Vice President and Head of Global Clinical Operations at Takeda, and prior to that, Pfizer and Lilly. And finally, Tamara Thompson is the Vice President of U.S. Government Affairs and Policy at Alexion Pharmaceuticals as the Corporate Affairs Executive and Health Policy Strategist with more than 20 years of leadership experience. Prior to Alexion, she led the Federal Executive Branch Strategy and State Government Affairs Office for Bristol-Myers Squibb, and has been a strategic policy advisor for three premier DC policy firms. So I'm not going to take further time. What I wanted to give an introduction to your approach to how you're thinking about this really transformative time in our country. So Asha, maybe I'll ask you first.
Well, first of all, I just want to sort of thank you and thank BIO for one, just putting on the summit. It's been absolutely phenomenal, and just so very happy that we're sort of just as an industry providing this the attention that it needs. And definitely want to thank you for inviting me to this panel very specifically. I'm super excited for this discussion, to have the conversation with my colleagues and also have the conversation with this large group that's joined us today. So as stated, I work for Virginia Tech Roche. And I think the way that we're actually looking at sort of clinical trial diversity is one multifaceted, right? I think what we're really trying to do is, I think our first tenet is that we truly believe that inclusion has to be intentional. We believe that this isn't something that you can simply sort of talk about or have a great a mindset for or not do it. We truly believe that you have to sort of have actions that are actually intentional to actually drive inclusion. And that's really what we're trying to do. And we're trying to do that across not just one segment, but really in resetting the entire clinical trial ecosystem. So we're looking at who is actually at the table across the board and how is that table set for clinical trials. So we have efforts to increase clinical trial research participants, the diversity of the patients that are involved in our trials. We are partnering to increase the diversity of research staff that are involved in actually conducting trials. And we also have efforts around bringing in PIs, principal investigators, and sites that are actually more diverse and or have access to more diverse patient populations. We want to make sure that not just one side of the people component of this is addressed, not just patients, where I feel like we spend a lot of time, but across the board, because patients to feel comfortable, they really need to sometimes see people who look like them or from their communities. And so we're really trying to partner deeply and have that diversity of people at that table. In addition to making sure that we have partners that are also diverse. So we actually have some efforts around vendor diversity to support our clinical trials. And then we're also looking at community partnerships as well for people who already sit in these communities, where we can sort of establish trust and establish communication pathways. And also, and I think this is actually quite important, to be proactive, because I think to change where we are currently will take years. And that this is not something that will happen overnight by increasing one particular number, but it's around really investing long-term in different ways of working and in different partnerships and showing up in different ways. And I think across the board, that's what we're actually looking to change, is not to change simply who we go to do trials, but our entire ecosystem that actually enables, supports, and allows our clinical trials to thrive. And so I will sort of stop there, but I just have to say, I've just been so amazingly proud of what we've done, but also across the industry, how holistically we've been looking at this, and just the understanding that this is something that's not going to change overnight, but for all of us, this is going to be a long-term investment.
Thank you so much. And a really wonderful way to set the table, as you said, with all of the various things that we need to consider. Daryl, I'm afraid you're going in and out. I don't know if you can hear us, so I'm going to call on Lisa, if I could, to speak. And then let me just ask, Daryl, are you seeing us go in and out or not? Yeah, why don't you go off screen for a minute, and then we'll hear from Lisa, and then we'll go to you if you're able to. Lisa.
Okay, thank you, Barbara. And I also would like to thank BIO for not only the invitation, but for the invitation to what I would agree is an incredibly important topic for our society and for the work that we do in clinical development. I'm, as Barbara said, Vice President of Clinical Development and Global Medical Lead for our COVID vaccine. And Novavax is in a somewhat enviable position in terms of our culture, because a year ago or a year and a half ago, before the pandemic started, Novavax was really in very, very bad straits. And with the pandemic, the building up of our vaccine capacity, and the help of Operation Warp Speed funds and Gates Foundation and CEPI and a whole bunch of other people, we have been able to embark on this incredible journey of bringing our COVID vaccine forward. To do that has required an enormous investment in new personnel. And there has been, from my observation, a real effort to have the new employee profile look like the profile of the United States of America, which is, as we all know, the white majority is rapidly disappearing. So we're seeing a much more diverse population at the company. I have to say that of the two people I've hired, they're both people of color. And they were chosen because they're the best people for the job. But it's nice to have a diverse group as well. In terms of the clinical trial that I've been in charge of, it's the one funded by Operation Warp Speed, our phase 3 pivotal registrational trial. And we got started a little later than Moderna and Pfizer and J&J. And we were warned by the folks at Operation Warp Speed that the whole issue of recruiting and enrolling individuals who were in the communities and the populations that were most affected by and most severely affected by the COVID pandemic needed to be in the trial. And so we spent probably, while we were traveling at Warp Speed, we probably spent a month or so selecting the sites that we would involve in the trial. And the first criteria after can you do this kind of research was, what is your access to racial and ethnic minorities? We actually had targets of recruitment in the protocol that said we want X% of the population to be African Americans, we want Y% to be Hispanic, Latinos, we want some proportion of Native Americans, American Indians. So we really made a huge effort right from the get-go to enroll a very diverse population. And the success there was that we met all those targets, because our sites represented the populations that we wanted. Our investigators represented the groups that we wanted, the communities we wanted involved. We went to 3 of the 4 historically Black universities, colleges and universities, their medical schools, to do the trial. We involved 2 reservations of Native Americans. We went to Mexico, where we got about half of our Latinos came from Mexico. The others are from Florida and wherever they live in the U.S. But there was a huge effort, and on a daily basis, sites would be held to meeting those kinds of targets as we were doing the enrollment. It was amazing, quite honestly. When we ended up with over 20% of the population in the study was Hispanic or Latino, 15% was African American, amazing 7% were Native Americans. And these are people whose lives were significantly impacted by the possibility of participating in this trial, because otherwise their communities had been decimated in many cases by COVID, and these people were incredibly grateful to have the opportunity to participate in the trial. Interestingly enough, the CRO that we hired also had to ramp up their personnel. And I'm pleased to say that while I had nothing to do with their choices, I'm pleased to say that they ended up hiring a very diverse group of employees as well. And I think this is partly because they're a global company and can pull in people from all over, but they also ended up with a very colorful group of folks working on the trial. So I think this is important. I think it's amazing. It's been educational to me to see what everybody's concerns are and what drives them to do what they do. And I think it's going to make a huge difference in medicine in general.
Thank you. You know, and your description of the process you've just been through is a perfect example of the intentionality that Asha described. You know, you approached it with intention, you executed with intention. Daryl, are you actually on or not? Okay, well, that's actually good, because I think, Melanie, you follow perfectly from, oh, there, wait, okay. Melanie, you follow perfectly from what Lisa was saying. So why don't you go forward?
Happy to. So firstly, you know, like the rest of my panel, a huge thank you for inviting me today. It's wonderful to be part of this panel and this very important summit. My name is Melanie Iverson. I'm the Chief Development Officer at Moderna. Moderna, obviously, like Novavax, has been thrust into the spotlight in the last year and a half as a company that really felt they could step up to find a solution and provide a vaccine for COVID-19. I'm sure also everybody is aware that Moderna had never run a phase 3 clinical trial before, and that was part of the massive challenge for us. We were a small group of people. I'd only just joined the company literally a few weeks before we realized that we were going to be developing a COVID-19 vaccine. And so we had that incredible challenge of pulling together the processes, the systems, the people, the tools to run our first ever phase 3 trial in this incredible media frenzy with the whole world watching everything we were doing. And so, like Novavax, back in the summer of last year, we were busy looking at our site selection, and it became very clear to us that the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on communities of color meant that it was more critical than ever that this vaccine was appropriately researched in those communities, and that we needed to not only set up our first phase 3 trial with all the right component parts, but we needed to really focus on DNA. We didn't have the large numbers of people that some of the other companies had, but we recruited rapidly and brought in a D&I lead as well as a health equity expert. And that was very much a theme at Moderna, listening to the experts, going and talking to people who could really help us. We, like Novavax, our site selection was based around, can you do this trial to a very high level of quality? And can you also reach out to a very diversity-rich population? Where are you in the country? And our trial was entirely conducted in the United States of America. And then thirdly, we also, like everybody else, we're going to be a case-driven trial. And so we had to use some epi modeling to actually monitor where were the cases going to be. So depending on whether you were the Pfizer Moderna trial, or you were AstraZeneca, or you were J&J, or you were Novavax, you were running your trial at a different time in this country. And there were different waves of the pandemic hitting different states at different times. So we all had to use our own predictive modeling to predict where people 6 weeks after their first vaccine would be when the pandemic would hit. And we predicted it would be in the middle of the country. So we were looking at a lot of, fantastic sites diversity, rich populations, and where the pandemic would be. So it was a very exciting time. Like Novavax, I'm really thrilled that our study did represent the US population, but it was incredibly challenging to do that. 5 weeks in, we were heading towards a largely Caucasian population. And I think we're all aware of the statistics that up until very recently, the average clinical trial in the US is conducted with over 90% Caucasian participants. And so about 5 weeks into our study, we were enrolling so quickly, it was unbelievable. We could have finished that trial very rapidly, but we didn't. We did something, we took a very bold decision, and we actually stopped enrollment of Caucasians into our clinical trial, which is a very bold thing to do in the middle of a pandemic, but it was absolutely the right thing to do. And we doubled down and focused on the recruitment of participants from communities of color, with increased information, outreach, reaching into the communities, providing the sites with a huge amount of data about where different communities are, and how they could do appropriate outreach and inform, training for our sites, all the things that Asha and Lisa have mentioned here that are so important we put into action. And we just saw this turn around. And it was really just the most remarkable and incredible experience for all of us. But we're not ending there. Moderna have made public commitments that each of our trials will enroll participants representative of the population most impacted. And so our next phase 3 trial is in CMV, which again has disproportionate impacts on communities. Publicly talked about how we plan to enroll that trial and where we, what our goals will be for enrollment. And like the other companies, we're looking at ourselves first of all. So we have a diversity and inclusion board that's made up of colleagues within our company, and a diversity and inclusion lead that supports our clinical trial efforts. But as a company, we're looking at ourselves and bringing in the right kind of talent. Exactly as Asha said, it's so important, from the researchers to the developers to the commercial organization. We want to make sure that everybody is representative of the populations that we serve. In my organization, the Clinical Development Office, we're just over 30% are from communities of color in my organization, about 75% are female. And we will continue to ensure that the best person for the job is offered that job. And I'm, like Lisa, thrilled to see the incredibly talented people from all communities and backgrounds coming in and wanting to be part of the Moderna story, wanting to be part of our trajectory. And so that just gives you a little flavor of some of the things that we've been doing at Moderna.
It really is wonderful to hear how the courage of the company to pause and say, we've got to do this differently, even though that was a potentially, significant risk to you. So that's really impressive. Tamar, let's hear your introductory comments.
Sure, thank you. I too want to just say thank you to the bio team for this opportunity to sit on this panel with such esteemed colleagues who have done so much on D&I in clinical trials over the past 12 to 18 months. It's just quite extraordinary to hear. And I especially want to say thank you to Asha and Quita, who is not on our panel today, but I think would be remiss if we talk about Genentech Roche without acknowledging Quita's efforts on D&I, because it is a model for our industry and the work that you are doing there. So thank you, Asha, and please send my extended thanks to Quita for the community. Much like, everyone on this panel, we've, struggled with this issue. And I think for Alexion in particular, we are a rare disease company. That means that our patients are in pockets of the world as is, right? In small pockets and small numbers. And so it's extraordinarily difficult for those patients to find one another, to find researchers, to find specialists. And so, trying to come together for the purposes of clinical trials is already a challenge for our populations. And then when you want to further stratify that, to be intentional about diversity and inclusion, I think it creates, additional opportunities for us to consider. We are very nascent in our own efforts. I think we're starting where many of the folks on the panel who have spoken with that intentionality, as Asha mentioned, and making sure that we have representation first and foremost within the company. Just this past year, we've hired a chief diversity officer and made sure that we have what we call ARGs, but our people resource groups that are representative of diversity across the company. And those folks are similar to what Melanie said, serving on a panel for us to ensure that we are moving forward, with that intentionality and how we approach clinical trials going forward. So I don't have as much detail to share because we are much more nascent in our efforts. But what I would like to talk about, and I think part of the opportunity that I have being maybe not on the R&D side of the world, but regulatory kind of from the government affairs standpoint, is that, not every company is going to be Moderna, Melanie, and make a public announcement to put forth that effort like you have, or like Genentech is doing. And so I think it's important for all of us to think about what's needed from a government affairs standpoint. And part of the work that I've been doing outside of my role within Alexion has been with the Women of Color in Pharma, which Quita is a part of as well, Asha, as you know. There is a proposal that the Women of Color of Pharma have put forward to think about how we can encourage greater diversity in clinical trials across the industry. And certainly, as we look to ourselves for our next PDUFA negotiation, as we look to ourselves, for Cures 2.0, what are we doing to make commitments for the industry to ensure that it's not 2 or 3 companies that are doing the right thing, that we as an industry move forward in that direction. So I would be remiss if I didn't mention those steps on this panel as well, and kind of take it from the responsibility of companies. I think it's fantastic when we are all looking to do the right thing, because this is, but not every company is going to take that direction. And so my work really has been focused around how we get the community at large to make sure that this is not, something that we're doing kind of what's contemporary at the moment. And 2 to 4 years from now, we've pivoted because we have been focused on health equity for quite some time in our community. But I really think that getting to measurable points for the pharmaceutical industry on how we move forward with diversity in clinical trials in a measurable way that has meaningful outcomes for not just a few disease states, but for many, is going to be extraordinarily important as well.
Thank you. Thank you. Really. Yeah,
actually, I think this point that Tamara makes is really important, actually, and it probably will come up in some of the conversations that we'll have later too. But I know we've had conversations. I've had specific conversations with our government affairs colleagues, because I think there are so many things that we can think about doing at this sort of lobbying level, at the government affairs level, to shift the entire thing for the industry. And I know something that comes up quite a bit are the stipend limits that we have for clinical trial participants in the US. And we look globally across the board, there are other sort of regulatory or government limitations that really do not help us have inclusive populations in other countries across the world in our clinical trials. And so I think as we're thinking about shifting this, I think as an industry, like, how do we partner across the board with pharma? How do we partner across the board with bio to have a legislative agenda that can truly enable us to be inclusive, and again, address the different issues across the different countries that actually limit our ability to be inclusive in our clinical trials? I think this is actually a really important point for sustainability of this.
Thank you, really important. Daryl, are you able to be on? I think we missed the window. That's not sounding hopeful. So,
correct. We're still trying to bootleg Daryl, but he is not here at the moment.
Okay, well, if he comes, we'll give him a window of opportunity, but then otherwise I'd love to dig in to the conversation. And Tamara, you started with this question of metrics, and how do you think about sort of what metrics you're going to hold your organization to, and internally and externally, and they may be different. You know, the organizational metrics do not necessarily have to be public, but at some point there needs to be some thought to what public metrics we should share and help one another, not necessarily as a gotcha metric, but we have been successful in this, learn from us. So maybe you could speak to the metrics that you're using and thinking about in your organization, then I'd love to come back to each of you to answer.
So I will say within our organization, as I mentioned, you know, we're, you know, fairly nascent here, and where we are tracking specifically is looking at, you know, 100% of our phase 2-3 studies and committed to tracking diversity, and then, you know, reflecting real world representation in our clinical programs. That's, you know, 2 of the ways that we're looking at this. We've also developed and activated, you know, a 3-year roadmap for our internal priorities to help us to reach these aspirations and a few others. So that's, you know, a great start, but you know, admittedly, we're nascent in our efforts here, especially when compared to some of my colleagues on the panel. But I think, you know, when we start looking more broadly, there are, you know, the piece of the internal metrics, would love to hear from others who, you know, have more experience, more broad experience in doing this more recently. But when we, you know, start thinking about carrots and sticks, from a government affairs standpoint, what I would, you know, look to as an opportunity is what we've done in the pediatric, you know, space with pediatric vouchers, what we've done with, you know, orphan ODA, and opportunities for industry to, you know, have incentives, you know, to do this. I know some folks aren't going to agree with that. And I know that industry is already on the hot seat on drug pricing and a number of other variables. But I think that, you know, when we look at opportunities, not every company, as Asha said, is going to have, you know, the incentive, you know, across the globe to be able to move forward. And so, you know, internally, our efforts are emerging, but I do think we need to think about, you know, not only our internal metrics, but we need to think about what we can be doing as a whole, you know, for the industry to try to set, you know, carrots instead of sticks to encourage us to move forward in ways that matter. One last thing that I'll mention before I close and turn it over to others on the panel is that because we are the pharmaceutical industry and tying this to ESG, we might ought to look at that as well. You know, we might ought to look at what we're reporting out on our, you know, ESG requirements, you know, from a board level, what our investors are expecting of us, and start to look at some of, you know, the things that we as an industry might want to do because it is the right thing. And you know, in reporting out from a D&I perspective, not only culturally within the company, but, you know, as we're reporting for clinical trials as well. And welcome, Daryl. It's nice to see you back.
Welcome, Daryl. Are you on stably?
Well, I'm not sure that I'm stable, I think, but
I didn't ask if you were stable.
Yeah, no, it looks like we got it sorted out. It's interesting how these things are sent to trials. But my apologies to everyone for not being part of it until.
Not a problem.
But glad I could join.
And wonder if we could, while we've got you for certain, maybe you could make the opening comments you had thought about in terms of the organization and sort of how you're organized and how you've prioritized this area.
Okay, yeah, it's a little, you know, disadvantage now, not knowing exactly what everyone else is talking about. But, you know, I think for us at Amgen, I mean, firstly, you know, in broad strokes, well, let me tell you a little bit about myself. So I head up the Global Medical Organization and serve as the Chief Medical Officer at the company. We're an integral part of the broader R&D organization and sit alongside global development, research, and the operations component of R&D. So my purview here is to act as that sort of external agent for change and partner a lot with outside organizations to advance, in essence, diversity in clinical trials for us is a component of the overall problem of inequality in accessing healthcare across the board. And so it's a snapshot of that. It's not an independent problem. So the way we kind of frame this is that as part of our broader programming and effort to really be, we're an integral part of the industry or life sciences, which is an integral part of the broader healthcare ecosystem globally. And so, our approach to addressing and redressing there is to really build programming across the board internally. And that starts with our diversity, inclusion, and belonging activities within the company. So change comes within. So really drive that within the company. We have a focused area on inequality in health, so equity in healthcare globally. And a component of that is the clinical trial diversity. And so, we have the one area where we can really make a difference besides our making our drugs available and accessible as far as possible across the spectrum of the entire healthcare ecosystem is in clinical trial diversity. And so really focusing in on efforts to improve recruiting a truly representative patient population into all of our clinical trials. And so we've got specific program. We can talk about this in details. I don't want to get in, usurp the entire remaining time here, but we've got dedicated resources to this that work very closely with all of our clinical trial teams within R&D. We partner externally extensively, and as I say, all of this is really anchored on addressing our goals in becoming a far more inclusive workforce that is truly diverse and where everyone has a sense of belonging.
Thank you. Great. So we were, when you were able to come back on, we were just talking about the metrics that organizations are using to sort of establish your baseline and then to know how you're doing, and to ask each of you to speak specifically to how you're setting metrics internally and externally, because they're obviously going to be different. We heard from Tamar. Who would like to take that on next? Okay, I'll call on you. Asha.
Yeah, look, I'm happy to go next too. I think a lot of things that sort of actually Daryl, Lisa, and Melanie talked about, and Tamara as well, is around the representative patient populations. I think that's really where we're trying to anchor around when we have a lung cancer patient, we have a prostate cancer trial, like do the participants in those trials actually represent the patient that we actually want to serve if we're able to commercialize that therapeutic regimen. So that's probably the first and foremost one that we're really trying to look at, and that requires quite a bit. And I don't think that's anything that we're going to across the board, definitely not across our large and diverse portfolio, going to solve tomorrow. But that is sort of our North Star, to have that. And then I think, again, when we sort of circle back or take a broader look across the board, the other thing that we're also looking to do too are put in place things that will lift all boats, if you will, right? Things that will really help broaden the ability for many people to be a part of our trials. And what we know about clinical trials is that logistics, transportation, as well as taking time off of work, all of these things are huge impediments to people without lots of resources, regular people being involved in our trials. And so some of the partnerships that we're doing are partnering with organizations, for example, like Greenfire, that can provide assistance, financial assistance for our clinical trial participants. Sometimes this is in the form of reimbursements. We're also looking at stipends, and that's why the topic I brought up earlier is so close to my heart. because we actually have in place an actual global partnership with Greenfire to actually help enable more access to trials for our patients, so that all of our clinical trials globally, at least sort of in late stage registrational pivotal trials, have access to Greenfire services to enable the burden for patients to be a part of our trials to be minimized as much as possible. And so we're looking at how many patients, how many studies actually access those services, and what are the services actually most useful to patients that are in our trials. The other thing that we're also looking at too, again, is our internal staff that we're leveraging, and also looking at as success factors, not necessarily metrics, but as in what we're trying to create, again, in this new ecosystem, are our community insights. So how many deep relationships do we actually have? Again, not something that's quantitative, but something that if we felt like we needed to understand, you know, a tribal population in the Southwest, how many community partnerships do we have that we could actually easily do that? That for me is sort of a North Star for us. These quantitative things, but also these relationships that really allow us to understand what even belonging might mean in the context of clinical trials and clinical trial research.
Thank you. And just to say, all metrics need not be quantitative. They can also be qualitative and informative in terms of directional. You know, for instance, you know, some of you talked about internal staff support committees and D&I groups within the internal environment. Some have external advisory boards for this. Those are metrics themselves as to how fully this is sort of entering through the organization. So thank you for that.
Yeah, one other thing I would mention is that the other thing that we're looking at is how many people across the organization actually understand this. I think it's been really interesting, our sort of inclusive research efforts. And at some level, and I think this is something that, you know, is appropriate to talk about too, and needs to be talked about, is that there's some team members that don't actually feel comfortable talking with our investigators about asking them what their population is and what is their access to diverse populations. That this isn't something that they understand necessarily why or even how to have these conversations. And in this charged environment, especially in the US, this is also a thing that we're looking at as success. Like, we need to be able to have these conversations in ways that people are comfortable with or sort of understand, even if there is discomfort.
Totally agree. And we need to catch our lawyers up as well.
And I'd love to build on that one, if I may, actually. I think, Ashley, you've made an incredibly important point that there can be discomfort with your team members and your CRO, but also the investigators themselves. We conducted implicit bias training for our investigator sites and had community engagement experts work with them to say, well, how do you greet people when they come in? What is the diversity of your staff? What language are you using? All these things, because we got told a lot of, well, there'll be retention issues and technology issues and all sorts of issues, none of which actually happened, right? We've got lots of data now to show those are not real issues. They are just excuses to not try. Yeah. And I know, you know, the other thing to add to your point is really around the data that we used. And so we provided each site with very specific data around their populations, a geospatial footprint that looked at the census data and where the different sort of communities are in that area to help them brainstorm and sort of troubleshoot around ways that they could actually think about, you know, where to go and provide information and where to sort of seek out often change agents within a community. Once you've found people who are interested to learn more and you can provide them with more information, there's word of mouth. And, you know, just we just saw the snowballing effect within communities once people started to realize what the sites were actually trying to do. And it previously it had just been an access issue. No one had tried to reach out to them, so they didn't know. And that was a major turning point for us.
Thank you. You know, it's so interesting because it's a real difference between, for instance, a vaccine trial and a, you know, rare disease trial as Tamara is working with, or with a vast portfolio as some of the other companies are. So thank you for that.
Barbara, can I say something to Melanie's point here that I think, and I would encourage Asha to add points if she feels so necessary as well. The statement that Melanie just made is very similar to the points that I hear in just general hiring practices in industry, that, the talent's not there, or, we don't know, but, if you hire one diverse person, chances are they have a network of more diverse people. And when you're looking for that diverse person, then you tap into that resource and they can tap into their network. And so to hear Melanie say it worked that way for clinical trials, to me, it suggests that that's formulaic, and so if you, and it kind of gets back to what Asha was saying around the intentionality at the beginning of the discussion. So I just want to point that out to say that, if you are intentional by having the right people at the table, then this isn't as hard as we've made it seem for perhaps the last, 40 to 50 years.
And I would really echo that. And I think that when we wrote our protocol back in August of 2020 and put in it, you will recruit 20% African Americans, or 15%, 20% Latinos, and as many American Indians as you can get hold of. Everybody just accepted it. It was a perfectly, it wasn't particularly shocking, but we held them to that. And we watched the enrollment on a daily basis. We enrolled our 30,000 patient trial in 6 weeks. And, we were watching the enrollment of the demographics every single day. Sites were warned that if they had too many people with white faces, they would be told to stop. And we didn't have to do it, Melanie, but we did threaten. So it was really very successful. We also hired a vendor was a participant recruitment vendor, and their sole remit was to find minority patients to enroll in the trial. And they wouldn't, if you were white and signed up and went to their website, they'd say you don't meet the criteria. So, because my sons tried to sign up and they said no. But you do have to plan right from the get-go. And I think that was very successful for us.
Yeah.
So, Barbara, I'd like to jump in here a little bit as well. So the metrics are one thing. So for me, the way we're approaching this is that specific quotas or recruitment targets it's important to increase from the baseline where we are now. But at the end of the day, what we're really doing is utilizing data and analytics. So we're in the middle of the information age. There's a plethora of information out there. It's important to use the right deep analytics to ultimately, firstly, understand the true epidemiology or nature of the illness for which we're developing the medicine or we're testing the medicine in. And the fundamental objective, and for me, the only metric that really matters, is that the population that is included in the study is truly representative of the population that is afflicted by the illness for which you're bringing the treatment to bear. And so it's really critical that we focus on that. And the key thing there then is that you really need to use analytics real time to ensure that you're actually enrolling the right patient population during the course of the study, right? There's no point in going back at the end of the study, locking the database, running the analytics, and to find out that when you're doing a clinical trial in intractable hypertension in Black African males, that you recruited an entire white population, that doesn't really fit the bill. So it's a very complex piece, and all the other pieces, what Asha was saying, Tamara was saying here, in terms then of how you really partner internally and externally to ensure that you're able to get the right patient population enrolled into your trials, is ultimately the how and to achieve it. But the only metric that really measures here is that the population in the study is representative of the population that we're trying to treat.
So let me pick up on that, because it dovetails with a question that's in the chat, which is, how do you get the epidemiology? And from what I've understood, each company basically is inventing it, or not inventing, but creating the data sources to do that analysis, instead of having a federal commitment just for the US, let's say, to say, here's the data by stage, disease, severity, and this is what we see across the US. Now, I don't understand why we're spending money when we have the data. It's just that it's not analyzed and shared.
That's right.
Can I just add a point about the data, Barbara?
Each of your companies are buying the same data to do this analysis. Yes, Tamar.
Yeah, so just one point, and this is me putting on my coder hat, having been, on the clinical registry side of this. So not all the data is going to be as robust as we would like to believe that it is. And I would just, speak for the rare disease community. When you don't have a strong, robust data set, you don't have an ICD code that represents that diagnosis. So you're not able to find the patients in the first place. And then you're not sure, what those patient populations look like with respect to diversity and inclusion. Then it makes it a little bit harder, I think, to come to the table with that, mindset. And if there are no codes, right, in many cases, like in rare disease, we don't have codes that we patients, to be able to identify them, then that's where the rub comes in. But Daryl, I agree, when you're talking about a diabetic population, when you're talking about larger, more robust patient populations where you can, see the epidemiology very clearly, I think there's an alignment there. But when you're talking about small populations, it's challenging.
So let me just say that I would be very hesitant personally as a public citizen to say that we should halt, appropriate therapeutics for rare disease populations till we get the right last person in the right demographic. We need to get those medicines to the public, to treat the people that are affected, and then use our data sources and real world data or post-commitments to look at the relative efficacy and safety. I think that it would be a mistake to set this up.
No, Barbara, I think we're saying the same thing differently. What I'm saying is the data's not there today. So being able to qualify the population based on today's data is a mistake. Yeah.
So for all the common diseases, why don't we have this as a, one of the government asks or government affairs asks?
Yeah. Well, there are illnesses for which we're, certainly at Amgen, we're focusing in on, prostate cancer is a great example, right? Where we actually do know the relative impact on different population groups. And, it would be really remiss of us to an advanced patient prostate cancer patient population to only target 25% or 30% of African American men in that study, right? I think that's really what I'm trying to say here is that, we might not have the most robust data for all the illnesses, but we certainly have access to data sets, and there is the ability to really do relatively sophisticated deep analytics of those data sets to really at least have a baseline understanding of what it is we should be including, or who it is we should be including in our study. And I think it starts there for me.
Yeah. And I don't think anybody would disagree, or would you? No. I mean, the only thing that I will put a little comma or asterisk on what you said, because for whom the drug is intended or the interventional product is intended is independent of insurance. Because just to say.
That's right. And I think that's where, right at my opening comments that, this is a part of the broader problem of, accessibility and equity in healthcare that, persists, particularly in the United States. And, we need to find a way of addressing, the entire inequity, but at least we can do something in terms of the clinical trial participation.
So let me pivot, if it's okay with you, to another question in the chat that's been upvoted. So whose responsibility is it to ensure the entire industry, including CROs, takes on greater trial diversity and access as a goal? In other words, how do we avoid this being either, you know, the 2021 moment or company specific? And, you know, if we say, well, it's everybody's responsibility, then possibly it's no one's responsibility. So how do you think about that? Who's really on top, keeping us honest?
Probably the FDA. They're the ultimate judges of our results and our product. And I have to say that when they introduced, first of all, PREA, all of a sudden everybody has to do a pediatric trial, has to plans for pediatric trials. Daryl probably doesn't have to do prostate cancer in kids, but you know, we have to do pediatric plans. When they look at the data set that one comes with from they introduced what, maybe 15, 18 years ago, the requirement to include analyses by age, race, gender, and ethnicity. So you have to do it. And if you have big zeros in any row of your table, it's not going to look good. So
yeah,
I think,
and it's been there, big zeros in our tables for the 15 years that it's been a requirement. Just to say,
maybe that's not been my experience. I think I have always taken this pretty seriously in the trials I did. I started out with HIV drug development, and we needed not just young white males, we needed women, we needed Black and African American folks. If I had to report it, I better have some of those people. So.
Mm-hmm. Others? Whose responsibility?
I would agree. I'm not sure if it's the regulators' responsibility, but I think they have the opportunity to really drive change. And it's not just the FDA. I mean, the MHRA have released guidance, EMA, EMDA, and that's one of the challenges, right? It's you're trying to get drugs, therapeutic vaccines approved globally, and so everyone's going to look at this a little bit differently. But I think there should be very firm expectations on the industry, and we should be holding ourselves accountable to, as Lisa said, that analysis has got to be there. And if you go into it with the expectation that I am going to set this up so that my trial is representative of the population that's impacted by this disease, everything Daryl said has been very interesting on that point. And it's done by design. I design my trial for the population that's going to benefit. And then, hopefully the regulators will really champion that. I don't know if it's their responsibility. I think that word of responsibility makes that question very difficult to answer.
I agree with you.
It suggests that, someone's going to police it, right? And I think what we're saying as an industry, policymakers, regulators, the industry, the whole ecosystem really want to come together and do something together and evoke change. And I really think this is a turning point for the industry.
And I want to make it clear that I am totally here for this. I mean, I'm being provocative in part, but we spent the last 3 or 4 years developing a pretty comprehensive guidance to achieve diversity, inclusion, and equity, and we're continuing to work on that and made all of that available. So I am intentionally really trying to make sure that we figure out how to make this a permanent change so that 5 years from now, it is part of who we are. And we're not talking about it because it's an expectation, and every trial does it. But, we've got to get there.
Yeah, Barbara, if I might just quickly jump in here, is that, while you're right, you can't say that it's everyone's responsibility, because then fundamentally everyone is going to say, well, you know, Barbara's going to be doing it or Asha's going to be doing it, and so I can step back. But I do think that, you know, everyone who's involved in conducting these studies really needs to be held accountable for their studies. But the point here, I think, is that, you know, one company in industry cannot do it alone, and even a consortium or a you know, a sort of partnership within industry is not going to do it alone. It's really going to take a concerted effort to ensure, as Melanie was saying, across the ecosystem, that we're all really holding hands, you know, and connecting to ensure that, you know, within the broader ecosystem, we're all participating actively to address the problem and find solutions. Because I think, you know, we've got programming that we feel pretty proud of, but it's just not enough if you're not able to really, you know, establish a broader, integrated community of clinical trial sites across the board that are not just going to serve our needs for one specific study, but that really advances the capability for the benefit of ultimately the patients that are being underserved.
Yeah. I agree with Daryl. If I can just hop in here for a second. I think I understand what Melanie was saying. You know, yes, there's a component here for the federal government. There's the FDA piece or the EMA, you know, what the global look from the regulatory lens. But I do want to just come back to something that I mentioned very briefly, is the, you know, ESG, the, you know, environmental social governance process of this. I really think there's a role there. And Barbara, to your point, working on this for many years, I think that there is a pivotal change that's occurring, because now companies, publicly traded companies, have to, you know, have a responsibility to include diversity within their boards. That's not something that we saw in years past, right? Where, you know, this was a requirement. If you look at California in particular, they now have a requirement that if you're a company within California, not only do you have to have a female, but you also have to have a person of color. If you have people of color on your board, those people of color are going to make you accountable to the leadership of the company. Leadership of the company is going to make the clinical trials team accountable to. So I think it is a top-down and a grassroots bottom-up approach that we need to take here. And I think also this, you know, kind of corporate activism, I don't want to become political on this call, but the idea of, even though that's my job most of the time, but the idea of corporate activism, if you look at the number of companies that have come out to either you know, respond to the incidents, I'll leave it at that, you know, from earlier this year, or even mid-year last year of in June with, you know, George Floyd, or, you know, the Capitol circumstances. Companies are being held accountable for behaviors in ways that we've never seen before. And while we're starting to see that with, you know, consumer purchasing power, I think what's unique about healthcare is that the patients haven't figured out that they have that same power just yet, but they, you know, they're getting there with the patient advocacy groups. And, you know, with advocacy, I think they're getting smarter to, you know, understand that, like consumers of Nike shoes, they also have purchasing power. And we'll start to use it. So I do think we're at a pivotal point of change, Barbara, where, you know, it's not one level of accountability. We should be making the totality of the ecosystem accountable. Patients should recognize their purchasing power. And we should also, you know, from the top down, from governance, from our investors, should be asking those questions. You know, what are your plans around D&I to make sure your clinical trials are effective before I invest in your product? So I do think it is a holistic ecosystem, you know, approach that we have to take, because just taking a regulatory process, you know, and saying carrot stick really isn't going to move the needle in the meaningful ways for this to be long lasting in the ways that I think everybody on this panel and on our call today would like to see.
Yeah. And I think it's exactly the intention of BIO to bring that forward in this kind of summit.
Can I jump in really quickly?
Absolutely.
I think that's just a really good point too. And I think this is a point I've tried to make sort of in other writings in place. So I'm on a publicly traded board, not based in California, but one of the things that course, we're always talking about is sustainability and the profitability of that company, right? And one of the things that I think about in terms of pharma boards and governance is if you have a drug development company and the largest market that you have is the US, and the demographics of that largest market is changing, and all of your targeting is to the group that's getting the smallest, that is not financially sustainable for you to be a successful company. So I think there is actually this shareholder responsibility that actually sits at the boards and with the executive teams, that they actually should be accountable for this, and if boards aren't actually having that conversation with them, that board is actually not doing their job either. This is not just about access, this is actually about the financial sustainability of actually targeting the demographic that will actually drive the profitability of drug development companies for the future. And if you aren't doing that, then you actually aren't doing what's in the best interest of the shareholders either. And I think that financial component is actually something we don't talk about enough in terms of corporate governance for drug development companies.
I agree, Asha. Well stated. I too sit on a public board, and for the very same reasons.
Great, great. You know, and I'll just say one thing, which I think sunlight will help. And the more that more transparency, look at what drug trial snapshots that the FDA put together has done for us. But that is, you know, we've done the analysis now, in the last six years, it's 288 drugs and trials. So, you know, we need to do better because they have a lot more information, and you all have a lot more information. And if we thought about making it public that we were trying to change from this baseline over X amount of time to achieve the sort of goals that you all said, we'd get pretty far. People will respond to, you know, to transparency. Not exactly the carrot, but it's not a stick either.
The transparency point is really important at all levels. One of the things that we did is we published our protocol on Redacted at the start of our trial, and we put our enrollment numbers out publicly every week, including breakdown by diversity. That was an unusual thing for a company to do, and you know the companies did the same thing. But I think if every company were to do that, to say, what is our intention? How will we do it? This is our protocol. Read what we're doing here. If we could break down a lot of the mystery around research and this confidentiality that isn't always appropriate, and broke down the mystery that it's somehow difficult to access, I think that would help a lot. And I think that transparency is very important, and the companies all need to get together and make that the norm, I think.
Well, and I'll say from our side on the academic, we're not very good at it. We don't make our own data transparent. And, you know, if anything, industry's better than that. So we all have to step up. You know, and let me pick up on one other question in the chat. In the spirit of data-driven feasibility, do you ask sites to give a specific breakdown by race and ethnicity regarding their enrollment targets? And how do you hold them to those targets? And I'll add one other piece to that, is when you tell, you know, the 450th white person they're not eligible, do you do that by site, or do you do that as a, you know, sort of block in the trial? Or and would that be different if we said to, you know, once we're really good at this, we get to 17% Black or African Americans, and we say, we're not going to enroll the next Black or African because we've met our target. So how are we thinking about that? How do you set that? How do you make it a conversation which will be difficult, that people are comfortable having and that the public understands?
Well, we did exactly what you just said. We had percentage targets for the entire study that was in the protocol, which we too, like Melanie, posted on our website. We told all the when we did feasibility evaluations for sites, we asked what their population looked like and what they thought they could do in terms of including racial and ethnic minorities. We went specifically to sites who did serve or do serve the racial and ethnic minority populations. As I said a moment ago, 3 of the 4 historically Black medical schools, 2 Indian reservations. Yeah.
So, and when they failed to meet those targets, you told the site they could not enroll, or you told the site they could not enroll any more white people?
I said we didn't have to do that because
I see.
We warned them. We warned them at the outset that that's what would happen if they had too non-diverse population.
Others?
The key thing here, Barbara, I know we're running out of time, right? But we've been spending a lot of time, in multiple other forums, but talking about that sustainable community, the network of trial sites, right? So, if you're going Thousand Oaks, California, because I can speak directly to that, you're very unlikely to recruit the appropriate diverse population, and no matter what quota you put on a particular site. So you really need to get the clinical trials into the communities where the patients are being treated, or at least find mechanisms of connecting those communities to where the trial sites are. But at the core of it, exactly, I think that, we will need to put some, recruitment metrics on to ensure that you're recruiting the right patient population, and to stop recruiting when you're exceeded or reached targets, or the numbers, of a particular group, or particularly if it's not the group that you're really intending to include.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so just to add to that, I think, absolutely, as I said earlier, we use local data, right? So there's no point going to an area going, I want you to represent the US population, if that's really not going to happen. Mm-hmm. What is that local information that I can gather? And it's not so much, I think, I'm here, I don't like the holding people accountable. It's how can we help them as well? It's not just saying, I need you to do this and I'm going to penalize you in some way. It's how can we partner together? What information can I provide you? What tools can I give you? I think that's where we have a huge responsibility, because not all sites are equipped for this. We have to really help them and educate them and bring them along on this journey. And I, everything that Lisa and Daryl said is so true, that day-to-day analytics, looking at your data every single day, making those micro adjustments has been really impactful. And I know we're running really out of time, so I'll stop there.
Yeah. I really think it also speaks to the kind of network of clinical trial sites that we want to create and sustain, not just for the pandemic or for emergencies, but for all clinical trials, because for the amount of training effort, capacity building that any site needs, they need to be kept warm, as we say, to continue to do trials, and that cannot be done by one company alone. These are not private clinics, and it's going to also take partnership in a real way, as each of you have spoken about, to make that possible. So does I want to thank everyone in the last 34 seconds before we get shut off. This was an incredibly interesting and dynamic conversation, and at least for me, it made me feel like this is a real commitment, and it's possible. It's possible with intention and with the kind of, North Star that we've been talking about. And I look forward to 5 years from now, not having this conversation, but having a different one. Thank you all.
Thank you, Barbara. Thanks, everyone. Great to meet you.
Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. Bye. Bye.
So what a great day we had today. We make sure my mic is working.
Hi, Carter. Yes, your mic is working.
All right, wonderful. Well, what a great day that we had today. We started the day really thinking about lessons learned and how we can better engage, collaborate, and partner with community organizations, physicians, and physician organizations. We had the second panel where we had executives basically explain to us that the intended goal, that the social and business imperative is one and the same, and that the intended goal is to not have this conversation in 5 years, but rather to have diversity be systemically integrated into how we approach clinical trials. We ended the day with hearing from leaders in our companies, sharing with you, the audience, the specifics about how they implemented internal strategies, set goals, and implemented against those goals. We invite you all to stay for an interactive networking session so we can continue to learn from one another as a community. And we look forward to having you all join us again tomorrow, where we're going to dig a little bit deeper into how to really think about implementing strategies that will create a more inclusive and representative clinical development ecosystem. So thank you all, and I look forward to seeing you in the networking session.